I remember the sound of the rain first. It was steady against the stained glass windows of First Grace. A hard, patient tapping that made the hymnal pages rustle even when no one was singing. The coffee urn hissed in the back, and the room smelled like burnt grounds and lemon cake. My fingers, swollen and slow from arthritis, kept whirring at the edge of a paper cup, the way my hands always do when I'm trying to be invisible. I'd been stacking disposable cups after Bible study, humming along when someone else read a verse. It felt wrong sometimes to be so small inside a room I had helped build. 60 years of Sundays sits heavy in your bones. Harold used to chuckle when I fussed over the chairs. "Ruth," he'd say, "you hold this place together." He's been gone 5 years now, and sometimes the church feels like both bridge and anchor. Tonight it felt like refuge from the rain. "Need a ride, Ruth?" Diane called, zipping up her slicker at the door. Her laugh always arrives before she does, like a bell. She was already buttoned into beige gloves and a scarf, all of it arranged like a small proclamation. "I am prepared." "I'm fine, dear," I said. My voice surprised me. "I'll walk. The movement will do me good." I had bought the navy coat for my birthday. Jennifer had pushed me into the shop. "Mom, you deserve something nice." And I had let her pick it. It was modest, but the wool hugged my shoulders without the poking stiffness of cheaper fabric. I remember the store smelling of cedar and new wool, and I remember pressing the brooch onto it, a small silver flower Harold had given me on our 10th anniversary. I never left the church without it. It sits over my heart like a small insistence. The side door opened to wind and the smell of wet earth. The rain hit the porch like applause. Under the little overhang by the steps, a figure sat curled into himself. He was hunched, thin, his clothes clinging to him like paper. At first I thought he was homeless. Somerset has seen more of that lately, and my first impulse was to cross the street. Then he lifted his head. His eyes met mine. They were tired, but there was a steadiness there that stopped my feet. He looked like someone who'd kept his dignity through a long hard winter. His coat, thin, waterlogged, had clung to his shoulders in a way that made him look smaller. He was maybe 50, maybe more. His accent sounded faint when he answered, but I couldn't place it. "I'm waiting for the bus," he said. His voice was quietly apologetic, like someone who felt he had no right to take up space. I could feel the rain finding every gap in my sweater. It made my spine ache. The church's heat had felt like a bubble safe, and the storm outside snapped it. I thought of the walk home. For blocks and puddles and wind, the apartment draft waiting like a question. I thought of Harold coughing in the night and of the time neighbors brought casseroles when he was in the hospital. I thought of how small kindness had felt then, and how big it had seemed. "Please," I heard myself say. My fingers were already at the button of my coat, fumbling. I took it off. The wool was warm, and for a second I felt foolish, like a child giving up a toy. I folded it, not too neatly, and held it out. The brooch chimed, a tiny click against my palm, cold and real. He shook his head, hesitated. "I can't." "Take it," I said. "You'll get sick out here." His hands were rough when he accepted it, and he folded himself into the warmth as if into a small chapel. He kept his eyes down. He said, "Thank you." And it was more than words, so much gratitude pressed into a single syllable that my chest tightened. I walked home soaked through to my bones. The rain found the seams of my sweater and made them sharp against the skin. The streetlights blurred into watercolor pools. My breath came in hard little puffs. My hands went back to the brooch on my lapel, feeling the familiar cool of silver, and I realized my heart was oddly light, as if I'd passed out some weight and it hadn't returned. That night I lay awake listening to the house settle. The radiator clicked. A distant car passed like someone driving through my thoughts. I could still see him on the porch, the way the coat sat across his shoulders. I didn't know his name. I didn't know where he would sleep. I only knew the small, fierce warmth of having done something. It was the kind of warmth that makes you ache later, when the feeling of being useful fades. I told Diane the next morning in the kitchen, stirring my tea with my usual hand. She smiled in a way that asked nothing and everything. "You always did have a soft heart," she said, and there was a pause I could taste like metallic tang. "But, Ruth, do you ever worry? Worry about what I didn't say? About change? About being seen? About whether a small act can mean something or whether it can be turned into something else?" The brooch pressed against my cardigan and I smoothed it with a finger. I did not know then that the man under the overhang would be standing at the pulpit a week later. I did not know that my coat would become a story told aloud or that, for the first time in years, I would feel all those pairs of eyes on me, curious, approving, suspicious. I only knew the quiet of the morning and the smell of wet wool on my hands. When I left the house that Sunday, I clipped the silver flower just a touch more securely and stepped into the church. "He's talking about me." My heart froze in my chest as the pastor pointed right at me, his voice booming through the wooden pews. My hands started to tremble in my lap, sweat running down my back despite the church's air conditioning. 60 years of faith, of giving, and suddenly every pair of eyes was on me. My loves, thank you so much for pausing your day to listen to this story. This channel is still finding its feet, and every new subscription feels like a breath of life. If this touches you, please click subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing our little community. I remember the rain before I remember anything else. It began as a steady tapping against the stained glass, Hinkley blues and amber roses that throw crooked light across the pews, and it kept time with my breathing. The coffee urn in the fellowship hall hissed like an old friend, and the room smelled of burnt grounds and lemon cake. Those ordinary smells are what ground me, like a stitch that holds a frayed sweater together. I am 68. I have the silver hair that Harold used to tease me about, cut into that same short bob I've worn for years. My hands are crooked with arthritis. They make the polite little movements of someone who has learned how to make herself useful and invisible at once. For most of my adult life, First Grace has been more than a building. It has been a ledger of weddings and funerals, of casseroles dropped off at the right porches, of the choir risers where I hummed while dusting. Harold and I sat in the third pew from the front. He liked the aisle. He liked the way the light hit the hymnals. There is an empty patch of varnished wood there, still warm in my memory. I glance at it sometimes like checking a pulse. On nights like that one, the church felt like refuge. The heat made the air smell faintly of old hymn books and beeswax. Someone had left a small brass cross on the altar, polished until the edges softened, and beside it an old Bible with a maroon cover, pages thumbed to a favorite psalm. A single white candle burned low. It cast its own small patience over the red velvet curtain behind the pulpit. Little things, I thought then, keep us steady. I had been stacking disposable cups after our Bible study, the task that lets my hands move so my mind can wander. Diane was already at the door, zipped into her tan slicker, gloves on, the sort of orderly readiness she wears like armor. "Need a ride, Ruth?" she asked, laughing like a bell already swung. Her laugh always felt like an invitation into the world of people who keep their plans on schedules. I smiled and said no. Walking grounds me, I said to myself. It was easier than explaining the tiny stubbornness that lives in my ribs. The coat was new. Jennifer bought it for my birthday and practically shepherded me into the shop. It was navy wool, modest, the kind of coat that makes a body feel set right without being flashy. I remember the shop smelled of cedar, and the saleswoman slipped the brooch, a silver flower Harold had given me, onto the lapel. I fastened it over my heart that evening as if anchoring myself. The brooch clicked. The metal was cold against skin. It is a small private amulet. People notice sometimes and sometimes they don't. Mostly it reminds me to keep showing up. There was an old clock in the fellowship hall that struck 7 as we closed the hymnals. The bells in the tower chimed, 3 slow notes that knock everything back into order. Those bells have marked most of so I took off my coat. I remember fumbling at the button because my fingers can't move the way they did. The wool smelled faintly of shop cedar and something like newness. The brooch caught in my palm. A tiny silver flower pressed into my skin. When I held the coat out to him, it felt like handing over a little private warmth. He hesitated. He tried to refuse. He folded himself into it like someone entering a small room. He thanked me in a voice that made my chest ache. On the altar the candle flickered. On the third pew the varnish remembered Harold's elbow. The maroon curtain behind the pulpit moved slightly as the furnace breathed. All those domestic, churchy details seemed suddenly luminous and fragile. Props in a room where one small act could tilt the balance. Later that week, Pastor Reynolds would frown across the council table at initiatives he found risky. Pastor Daniel would stand at the pulpit and make strangers into parables. But in that moment, in the hush of a rain-soaked night, none of that was visible. There was only the solidity of the coat in someone else's lap and the stubborn private warmth that comes from doing what your faith has trained you to do, even when your hands shake and your bones complain. I went home wet and warm at once. The rain having soaked my sweater, the thought of what I'd done warming my chest. I smoothed the brooch and felt, for the first time in a long while, that the small choices matter. The church bells had gone on ringing, their sound following me down the street, and somewhere in that pattern I sensed that change, quiet, slow, was coming. The week after Daniel told the story from the pulpit felt like living on the edge of a word. People smiled at me in the grocery store as if they'd seen a small miracle. Children waved. Diane fussed at me in the kitchen. Don't be silly. But there was a tightness in her smile. Pastor Reynolds' eyes followed me with something I couldn't name. It settled in my chest like a cold stone. Then came the council meeting. We met in the fellowship hall, the long table under the fluorescent lights that never quite warm. The lemon cake sat untouched on a paper plate. The coffee urn was a dull monument at the corner. Men and women shuffled papers, adjusted glasses, coughed into napkins. I sat near the back, hands folded so I wouldn't fidget. The arthritis makes my fingers go twitchy when I'm nervous. My brooch felt heavier than usual against my sweater, a little silver flower pressing at my heart. Pastor Reynolds spoke first, the way he always does, measured, deliberate, with that pin of the American flag on his lapel catching the light. He talked about budgets and bylaws in the kind of voice that makes numbers sound like absolutes. Then he shifted into that softer, colder place he goes when something inside him wants policing. We need to reevaluate the outreach programs, he said. Some initiatives, though well-intentioned, may not be prudent for our congregation right now. He didn't have to name Daniel's refugee visits. The sentence hung like a named thing in the air. I could feel the room turn. He kept looking at me as he spoke, not at my face so much as at the small familiar shape I make older, buttoned, predictable. His gaze landed like a question mark. It's about stewardship, he went on, and safety. We can't let ourselves be guided solely by emotion. We must be wise. When he said emotion, he smiled in a way that flattened the room. For a moment I thought I might be sick. My hands had gone cold. A kind of buzzing started behind my ears like the sound that used to come before a headache. My breath became shallow and quick. The heat in the hall seemed to pool around my collarbones and then leaving me chilled. Someone cleared their throat. Diane's gloved hand found mine under the table and squeezed, quick and tight. The squeeze said, "We're watching you." Across the table a younger elder shifted, papers rustling like dry leaves. The church secretary looked down at her notes as if they could hold the moment steady. Pastor Reynolds leaned forward, his voice softening to the kind of confession that asks for agreement. "We love our church," he said. "We must protect it. We mustn't let every passing story move us into risky commitments." When he said story, his eyes, sharp blue, found mine and paused. The pause was a small surgical thing. People who are led by impulsive kindness, who act without full knowledge. Well, sometimes that can open us to harm. The breath left me in a hard little sound. I felt as if someone had taken a pair of tongs to my sternum. A knot rose in my throat so tight I couldn't swallow. My palms were damp, the paper of the agenda sticking to my fingers. The fluorescent light made the varnish of the table gleam, and I thought for a ridiculous second of Harold's big hands on the same wood when he used to knock it to hush the children. Words crowded to the front of me like birds at a feeder. I could have kept silent. For all my life I'd been the woman who kept the hymnals tidy and the casseroles warm. I knew how to be small and indispensable. That smallness had its privileges: comfort, predictability, the soft protection of not being noticed. But when he looked at me as if kindness itself were a fault, something inside me unclipped. I rose. My legs moved before all the thinking. They trembled. I was aware of how my knees made a small complaint when I stood, the arthritis speaking like an old friend. For a moment the room tilted. My heart hammered against my ribs. I felt the pulse in my throat like a drum. "Pastor," I said. My voice came out like a wire pulled too tight at first, thin, shaky. Then it steadied just enough. When Harold was sick, people brought food. They sat with us. They didn't ask for papers or credentials. They just came. They saw a man who needed help and they helped. That is what this church taught me. A soft intake of breath. Daniel's eyes met mine from across the room, and there was a warmth in them that steadied me. He didn't have to say anything. I could see in his face the man who'd worn my coat the week before. Humble, grateful, not a statistic. "Is that imprudent?" I asked. "Is it reckless to give someone shelter from a storm? Is it foolish to hear a cry and answer it?" My hands were still cold. I smoothed the brooch with my thumb as if to feel the metal and anchor myself. The council table was silent except for the ticking of the analog clock above the kitchenette. Even the humming of the fluorescent lights seemed to lean in. Pastor Reynolds' mouth thinned. He cleared his throat and opened his mouth to speak, but the shape of what I'd said hung between us like an honest thing that did not let itself be dismissed. I could see in the faces around me that the question landed in different soils: fearful, curious, thoughtful. When I sat down, my legs trembling, tears filled the corners of my eyes. Not the big dramatic kind that floods the cheeks, but a quiet, hot press of feeling that left my throat raw. I realized then that the decision I'd made was not about winning a vote. It was about refusing to let a small moment of kindness be framed as naivete. Outside, the rain had started again, steady and patient. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of coffee and old books. The brooch pressed into my sweater like a secret badge. The room felt rearranged, as if an invisible set of furniture had shifted because a small, stubborn heart had refused to be silenced. After that night, I found myself noticing small things in the way people looked at me. Not all looks were the warm kind that used to land on the back of my hand like a pat. Some were quick, tight, like the way you press your lips together when you taste something sour. The story Pastor Daniel told from the pulpit had landed like a stone in still water. Ripples reached corners I didn't know existed. A few days later, Daniel came by my apartment with a thermos of coffee. He stood on my stoop, coat collar up against the drizzle, and hesitated like a man who had learned to measure the cadence of new places. "Mrs. Abernathy," he said, his voice soft with that gentle accent, "may I come in?" I opened the door. The house smelled of lemon oil and old books. He took off the wet coat he'd left on the banister and hung it as if he knew exactly where each thing belonged. "Thank you for the coat," he said, and there it was, the memory as if wrapped again around his shoulders. He didn't say your coat, he said the coat, which held nothing accusatory. He put his hand over his heart where the brooch had rested on me and smiled with those tired brown eyes. "It's nothing," I started. My hands were already smoothing the hem of my cardigan. I'm glad you weren't soaked." He sat in Harold's old chair like he'd been invited 100 times, and only then noticed the indentation where Harold used to rest his knee. "It was an act of grace," he said. "A small gospel." He paused. The pause was not empty. Not everyone answered the story with words of thanks. The week after the pulpit, Pastor Reynolds found me at the coffee hour. His smile thin, hands clasped in front of him like a man holding back a sermon. "Ruth," he said, and there was a tilt to his head that asked me to understand a greater thing. "We appreciate your zeal. But we must be careful how we extend ourselves. There are liabilities, health concerns, and resources to steward." He looked at the people gathered, some nodding, some folding their arms. His concern was dressed in caution, but his eyes landed on me with the expectation that I would retreat into the smallness he'd always liked to keep me in. "Of course," I said. "We will be wise." He nodded as if the agreement had been reached. But the pause between his words and mine had an edge. The sort of distance that builds when two people agree on the words but not the meaning. Diane's support came with wrinkles. She patted my hand at coffee hour, squeezed once and withdrew, lips pressed to hold her opinion in. "You always were too soft, Ruth," she whispered, a laugh that wasn't a laugh. "But—" her eyes flicked to the corner where the church treasurer discussed budget lines with a stack of papers. "Be careful. People get carried away." Her gloved fingers were warm against my knuckles. There was love in the pressure, a kind that came with bills paid and recipes perfected. But there was also fear, the fear of change, wearing perfume and sensible shoes. At the council meeting where they first raised the idea of re-evaluating the outreach, I watched faces like photographs I'd taken long ago. Some were surprised. Some were frightened. The young couple from the community garden, whose son had wanted to join the choir, shifted in their seats like children hiding a bird from a hawk. The deacon who'd taught Sunday school for 40 years rubbed his thumb along the margin of his notes, as if the ink might change if he worried it enough. Pastor Reynolds spoke of boundaries and policies, of safety protocols written into hard binding. He folded his hands where his wedding band flashed like a promise of steadiness. "We cannot, in charity alone, invite ourselves into risk," he said. "We must protect what has always kept this church safe." He never said word for word who he meant. He didn't have to. The sentence did the work for him. When he looked toward me, it was like he expected me to shrink. For a second I felt very small, like a child whose shoelace had come undone in the middle of a tidy room. When I spoke, my voice came from somewhere under the ribs where stubbornness lives. "When Harold was dying," I said, "this church didn't ask for credentials. They brought food. They sat with us. They knit my nephew's scarf even when their needles clicked slower than before. They did what a neighbor does." I watched the faces. A woman at the table looked away and picked at a seam on her sleeve. A man cleared his throat and took a breath that sounded like a hinge opening. "You call it charity," Pastor Reynolds answered, but his words were softer now. "Sometimes we must also call it prudence." His hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he reached for his glass of water. Microreactions like that say more than speeches. I noticed the way his wedding band slid an inch around his finger. I noticed the slight flare of his nostrils when someone spoke of newcomers as risks. In the weeks that followed, the conflict settled into a pattern of small battles. Daniel organized visits to homes where the smell of stewed tomatoes mixed with unfamiliar spices, and the children hid behind their mothers until they heard his laugh and came out. People who had once counted pews with their eyes now counted coats in the coat room. The choir grew louder on Sundays. A woman who'd been shy of newcomers taught a little Afghan girl how to tie a bow. Diane made a casserole for a family and left it on the step without knocking, then told me later how her hands had trembled when she did it. And still there were whispers. Opinions shaped like umbrellas, folded, then suddenly held open when storms came close. I would walk past the bulletin board and see flyers stapled where they always had been, but under them a new flyer for ESL classes tacked with thumbtacks that looked like hope. Sometimes I would pause, fingers on the edge of the paper, feeling the rough texture like a pulse. One Sunday after service, a little boy, dark-haired, eyes too large for his face, ran up and threw his arms around my legs. He smelled like oranges and the detergent of his mother's shirt. His laugh was a bell. For a moment the world narrowed to that sound and the weight of the brooch cooling against my chest. Pastor Reynolds watched from the front steps as people filed out. He didn't approach. He folded his hands and looked straight ahead. I thought I could see a plan unfolding in the set of his mouth. But in the same breath, I saw Pastor Daniel at the other end of the lawn, kneeled by a woman showing her son how to lace a shoe. They were both doing what pastors do, one with caution, one with courage. Both were preaching with hands. My coat had been a small thing. It had warmed a stranger on a rainy night. But now it was warming something bigger. An idea that was making people uneasy and brave at the same time. Every gesture after that felt like a photograph that wouldn't fade. Diane's reluctant casserole, the treasurer's pen hovering over a check, Pastor Reynolds' tight smile, and Daniel's open hand. I am learning that change rarely comes in a single sermon or decision. It comes in the rustle of a jacket, the smell of soup, a child's sticky hand on your sleeve. And it comes with the cost of hard conversations, of old rhythms disrupted. I find myself sitting in the church some nights, the hymnals closed, the single candle on the altar guttering, feeling the brooch press into my heart like a question and an answer at once. After the council meeting, the town seemed to rearrange itself around me. It started in small, unremarkable ways. The woman who used to hand me the hymnals with a wink now walked past, clutching her purse as if it were a shield. A child who used to wave from the choir loft pressed his face into his mother's sleeve when I smiled. The coffee hour felt like a glass bowl I had been set outside of, the plates of lemon cake left untouched when I neared, the conversation dipping like fish underwater until I moved on. At first I told myself I imagined it. Old women see shadows that aren't there. But the patterns multiplied. The greeter at the door, a kind man who had always saved me the seat by the third pew, started taking his post 2 minutes later, as if timing could erect a wall. When I reached for the door to the fellowship hall, the handle would already be turning, the other person's back to me, the laugh a fraction too loud. Doors closed before I crossed the threshold. Not slammed, nothing theatrical. Just folded shut like a polite refusal. Whispers came next. Not loud, not malicious, just the way small towns pass weather. A cough in the pew beside me that silenced when my eyes flicked over. Half sentences dropped like breadcrumbs. Well-intentioned, but we must think of stewardship. A phrase repeated the way a prayer is recited until its meaning becomes numb. People who once asked after Harold's health now asked about the budget, then looked at their hands. Their silence was not neutral. It was a slow, cool notice that said, "We see you differently now." Diane changed the most of all. She sat across the room at Sunday school now, voice lower at tea, hands busy with a napkin. When she saw me she smiled, but it was a smile with tight corners, as if it had been ironed into place. Once, when she reached to pat my hand, she pulled back as if remembering a rule. "Be careful, Ruth," she murmured one morning, the words soft and urgent. I thought she meant for my knees. Later I understood she meant for my reputation. Sometimes avoidance wore the thin coat of civility. People would compliment my brooch at the grocery, then quickly add, "But perhaps it's best to be cautious." A man who'd once brought casseroles to our house stopped making trips with covered dishes. He texted a prayer request instead. The youth leader who once asked me to help with Christmas pageants passed me a bulletin without meeting my eyes. The edges of my days began to feel frayed, like the sleeve of an old sweater. There were moments of cruelty that had no malice in them, only fear finding a body. A woman from the choir excused herself mid-hello, her voice thin. A deacon I had known for decades crossed the street to avoid stepping into the same sunlight. At the supermarket, someone in the produce aisle turned their cart to form a buffer. A door that had always opened for me now clicked shut before I reached it. Small actions with large implications. They accumulate like rain. When the children from the refugee families started coming to the after, rumors sprouted like dandelions. Someone suggested the coat was staged. Another said Pastor Daniel was stirring trouble. The suggestion that my gesture might have been naive mutated into questions about judgment, about where to draw lines between charity and caution. People read the sermon transcripts and annotated them behind their eyes. The church bulletin gained a new column, policy notes and reminders about volunteering forms, papers that suddenly felt like gates. Even my mailbox seemed complicit. A pamphlet about neighborhood watch programs arrived with a polite note. A letter from a member of the council, folded and official, thanked me for my years of service but urged prudence in future interactions. The handwriting was familiar. The tone was distant. It felt like receiving an invitation to a funeral for a way of being I hadn't known needed a burial. One Thursday morning I walked past the community center and saw Pastor Reynolds through the window, speaking in low tones with the treasurer. They gestured toward a clipboard. He didn't look up when I passed. The sight of him there, composed, hands folded, felt like a line being drawn in wet cement. It made the town seem smaller, as if I had been moved to a place where every step required permission. At night the quiet is loud. The house remembers Harold in the creak of the stairs and the dent in his favorite chair. I sit by the window and listen to the rain, and sometimes it sounds like the hush of people holding their breath. I press my thumb against the silver flower on my coat that I keep indoors now, and it is both an anchor and a question. The more the town closes in, the more the brooch feels like a small flag, one I did not know I had raised. Isolation can be gentle and almost tender. It can come on like a soft blanket, until you realize it is a shroud. Faces that once reflected my own life now mirror back distance. It is a strange thing to be revered in the pulpit and avoided at coffee hour. It is a stranger's story turned inward, a warmth given out and then watched like evidence. And yet, in this tightening, there are moments that unravel the quilt of exclusion. A child who clings to my skirt in the grocery and laughs. Pastor Daniel handing me the thermos across his crowded doorway. A note tucked under my door from someone too shy to speak. Those small resistances keep me from folding entirely. Still the pattern remains. Doors close. Conversations thin. People look down when I enter a room and speak as if they are choosing words from a list. The town is rearranging itself, and I am learning what it feels like to be on the outside. The rain keeps time on the sill, patient and steady. I fold my hands and listen. He's talking about me. The words land before I can decide whether to breathe. The pastor's finger is an arrow across the wooden sea of pews, and for a dizzy second the varnished benches feel too narrow to hold me. The air in First Grace seems to change its weight, thicker, as if the ceiling itself is holding its breath. Pastor Daniel's voice fills the sanctuary. It's softer than the amplification on the microphone, but when he lowers it the whole room leans in. The vibration of his words rides the old rafters. You can hear the hymnals shift, the shuffle of shoes. His cadence makes the stained glass light tremble on the floor like spilled color. He starts to tell the story, the rainy night, the coat, the brooch, and every syllable settles like a stone into the quiet. I feel each one. I keep my hands folded in my lap, fingers woven together until the knuckles blanch. It is an old habit. Hold your hand so you don't start moving your whole body like a thing about to fall apart. I count my breaths. In, out. Slow enough to keep the pulse from hammering itself through my throat. My palms are damp. The air smells of lemon cake and old wood polish. The particular scent of our sanctuary that always makes me think of weddings and funerals both. Pastor Daniel's eyes find mine again. He pauses, the microphone catching the after rattle of his breath. She did not ask who I was, he says. The words drop like a bell. There is a murmur at my left. Someone reaching for a tissue. Someone else clearing their throat. The sound is small, but the echo that follows is large. I feel rather than see the shift in the room. People straighten. The man who always sleeps in the back pew sits up as if pulled by a string. Diane's hand finds my sleeve under the hymnals and squeezes. Quick, frightened, the way she squeezes when she's trying not to cry. I hear Pastor Reynolds' chair creak in the front row as he shifts. He is sitting very still, the set of his jaw like a hinge ready to swing. Daniel's voice rises, not in anger but in a kind of steady, blessed certainty. He speaks about hospitality, about recognizing Christ in strangers, and the words have a simple, dangerous power. They open a space between what we say we are and what we do. The pulpit would smell sharper in that moment. Oiled oak and the faint iron of the microphone stand. I hear my own breath as if someone else is in the room with it. A candle on the altar guttered then, small flame fighting a draft, and I watch it die. The wick goes black with a tiny soft sigh. The sound is ridiculous to anyone else. A wick, a whisper. To me it is a punctuation mark. Somewhere above, a small crucifix that has hung crookedly for as long as I can remember gives a soft, metallic clack and tips. It doesn't smash. It lands against the plaster with a dull thump and slides a hair off its nail. Heads turn. A door at the back of the church opens with a protest. A long, slow creak that cracks the hush like a laugh. Symbols, people say. But symbols have weight. The candles leaving the flame, the crucifix shifting. Tiny ruptures that feel like a statement. The sanctuary that has been so steady all my life shows a new seam. The echo of Pastor Daniel's last sentence still hangs like smoke. I tell myself to stay small. To be the woman who hums in the choir loft, who hands out casseroles, who keeps the spare change for the youth fund. But my lungs have other plans. A heat rises in my throat that is equal parts shame and something like relief. I can feel Harold beside me the way I always do in moments like this. A sense of a larger presence that steadies my spine. The brooch at my heart seems to grow hotter against my cardigan. Pastor Reynolds stands then slowly. The church holds its breath as if the next act is a hinge in a play we did not audition for. His voice when he speaks is controlled, clipped. It tries on gentleness but fits like a suit 2 sizes too small. Pastor Daniel, he says, and the name is a measured thing. We value generosity. But we must also steward the flock. The word steward lands like a coin on wood. Some nod. Others frown. My hands clench so tight that the silver of my brooch presses into my palm. I try to keep my face neutral. I try to fold that hot feeling down into the smallness I've practiced my whole life. My breaths are precise, measured 1, 2, 3 like those old hymns that count you back into rhythm. Daniel's response is soft and steady. He does not name Pastor Reynolds' fears. He speaks of children singing, of coats in the winter, of families who came trembling and found soup and a smile. His words are an offering and a challenge wrapped in the same cloth. When he says, "This is what we are called to," the room cracks open a little. It smells briefly like rain on hot pavement, fresh and sharp and promising. A murmur starts, acquiescing and anxious both. Some faces are lit, softened by the story. Others draw a tighter line across their mouths. I feel the pressure of being both exemplar and accusation, a contradiction I never meant to personify. Heat climbs my neck. I press my thumb against the brooch until the metal bites a little. I let myself remember the coat on his shoulders, the way he folded his hands over it like it was a prayer. The crucifix settles back into place with a small scrape, as if returned not by force but by gravity recognizing its proper home. The candle stubbornly catches again from a volunteer's quick movement by the altar, wax smudged, flame licked back to life. The church breathes. The small ruptures stitch themselves with gestures. A hand, a match, a quiet correction. But nothing is the same. The echoes of this morning will follow us. To the fellowship hall, to the council table, into the way Diane sets the coffee out next week. There is a crack now and light is seeping through. I fold my hands again, slower this time. No one will call me heroic in the same breath that some will call me rash. That is the cost of being seen. The sermon ends. People file out with coffee cups, with the familiar shuffle and the new stiffness. Some come to touch my arm to say thank you. The next meeting was supposed to be another dry bureaucratic thing, minutes, budget lines, a vote that would likely be footnoted into oblivion. I sat near the end of the long table, the fluorescent light making the silver of my brooch wink like a small private lighthouse. My hands folded the way they always do when I am trying to keep from speaking. The coffee urn sighed at the far corner. Diane's fingers found mine under the table and gave a quick warning squeeze. When Pastor Reynolds started, his voice was the same careful instrument it always is, measured, polite, with that little pin of the flag catching the light on his lapel. He spoke about stewardship and liability, and for a while I could feel the room settling into the same old rhythm. Cautious, neat, contained. Then the back door opened and in walked a woman I didn't know, the kind of woman who carries a folder like a promise. Behind her were two people I did know. Pastor Daniel, tall and steady, and a small mother I had seen in the choir last Sunday, her son clinging to her skirt. I remember the way the light hit the boy's hair, gold on dark, and how the room tilted toward them. The woman with the folder introduced herself quietly as Marjorie Hale from the denominational missions office. She said she had come because of a telephone call, the good kind, the kind that has paper attached to it. I was sent here with some information, she began, and there was no sermon in how she said it. She opened the folder and handed a letter across the table. The paper was soft at the edges, the ink familiar as a voice. It was from a small family in the city where Pastor Daniel had been working before he came to us. The mother, Layla, had written a short note in careful English. She described a night of rain and a man with a tired face who offered them shelter in a doorway. She wrote of a coat someone had given to that man, how he wrapped his child tighter, how inside that small warmth they found the courage to take another bus, to look for help, to find him again later at the shelter. He told us about a church, she wrote, and that church gave him a coat. Because of that coat we found a door. I could feel the air change. It wasn't dramatic, no thunder, no choir of angels, but something like clarity settled across the table. Marjorie slid another paper forward. A copy of a community partnership agreement. A modest grant that would bring funding for ESL classes and a part-time family liaison. There was a paragraph about liability and background checks, about policies and training, the very things Pastor Reynolds had asked for in the meeting before. The grant had been approved weeks ago, pending only local acceptance. You were told? Pastor Reynolds asked, his voice thinner. Marjorie looked at him with that patient look of someone who handles paperwork for a living, and has learned to hold tension with both hands. We sent notice to the diocese office. We intended to support this congregation's outreach. Pastor Daniel's assignment came with resources. We came because we heard concerns and thought it best to clarify what had already been in motion. There it was, an explanation that didn't rub out the worries but answered them. The things Pastor Reynolds feared were not fantasies. They were the real questions of stewardship. But the way he had framed them had made charity look like naivete. The folder lay between us like a small flat truth. Then Layla stood. Her English made soft jumps, but her meaning landed like stones. We came here from Aleppo, she said. We had nothing. My son used to hide when it rained. He was afraid. The man with the coat told us about a church where people sang and children would not be afraid. He said someone had been kind to him. He said it here in our town. A woman, an older woman, gave him a coat on a night like that. If she had not, we might not be here. We might not have our school. We might not have our child learn to sing like he does now. Her voice shivered and steadied. She placed her hand over her heart and looked straight at me as if reading me like a ledger. The room did not explode. It simply rearranged itself. People who had been leaning back now leaned forward. The treasurer, Mr. Ellis, a man with a habit of counting everything, folded his hands and said, I wasn't aware the match funds were approved. I'm sorry. I should have been clearer. His apology was thin, human-led. Pastor Reynolds' face softened in a way that made him look smaller and somehow more honest. He cleared his throat. "I will admit," he said, choosing words like a man picking stones out of a shoe, "that I was concerned. I should have checked the facts before raising alarm. For that I apologize." The apology landed differently than a sermon might. It was small and real. The council did not decide everything that night. We did not sing a hymn and call it done. But the vote we took, quiet, unanimous with a couple of hesitations, was to accept the grant and form a welcome committee that included Pastor Reynolds, Pastor Daniel, Diane, the treasurer, and me. The committee would write policies, set up training, and work with the missions office. It was a compromise, yes. It was also a truce. When the meeting broke up, people did not swarm me like fans at a revival. But strangers came and touched my sleeve. A young woman I recognized from the choir pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand, her phone number and an invitation to help with the children's program. Diane stepped closer and, for the first time in days, hugged me without the tightness of caution. Later, alone in the sanctuary, I stood at the doorway where the rain had sounded like a memory. The wooden steps still smelled faintly of the rain that had come and gone. I touched the place on my heart where the brooch used to sit and felt the outline under my sweater. It was an absence that felt like a space made on purpose. Nothing about our town is fixed. Some will still worry. Some will still fold their lives into smaller shapes to keep the old certainties. But that night there was a ledger with new entries. A letter from a grateful mother, a grant packet, a hand extended across a table. The cost of being seen is not small. I learned that standing up costs you comfort and gains you a kind of truth. When I walked home that evening, the rain had started in a hush and was now just a rumor on the sidewalk. I walked slowly the way my knees allow me, and for the first time in a long while I felt the warmth in my chest was not only about a coat. It was about the fact that a small act had shifted the pattern of a room, and that the pattern had room for more than one story. Maybe that was what Harold would have called stewardship. Not protecting the linens, but preserving the heart beneath them. I do not expect the world to change overnight. But I do know this. A coat kept a man warm on a rainy night, and because of that, a child learned to sing without fear. That is proof enough for me. I stood in the sanctuary long after the others had filed out, hands folded the way my mother taught me when strangers or sorrow came through the door. The hymnals were closed, their leather warm from a morning of palms and voices. The candle on the altar guttered, then steadied, and the light it threw looked softer somehow, less theatrical than truthful. The council meeting had ended in that odd, small way most adult decisions do. A compromise wrapped in paperwork. We agreed to accept the grant, form a welcome committee, write the policies Pastor Reynolds wanted, and keep Pastor Daniel's visits to the families moving. It was not a victory or a surrender. It was a truce, and a beginning that smelled faintly of lemon cake and wet wool. When Marjorie Hale from the mission office handed the letter from Layla across the table, I felt the room tilt. Her words, careful English folded around an ordinary miracle, landed like a stone. If she had not, she wrote, we might not be here. It was small proof. It was also enormous. People came to talk after that meeting. Some of them touched my sleeve like a secret salve. Diane hugged me in a way that did not tremble this time. The treasurer adjusted his glasses and promised to look again at the budget lines. Pastor Reynolds said he was sorry. The words felt like an opening of something tight, and he agreed to sit on the committee. I could see the relief move across his face in a way that made him look tired and more human than he had in weeks. Not everyone softened. There were still looks that skimmed my shoulder and slid away. There were still soft, fearful sentences that began with "what if?" and ended in folded hands. Change is an awkward animal. It has claws and kindness in equal measure. But there were other things, 2 new faces in the pews, hands joined across the aisle, a little boy singing our hymns in a language that tasted like cinnamon. Once, after service, he ran up and hugged my legs like a compass finding north. I smelled oranges on his shirt and somehow the church breathed easier. Daniel came by my apartment with a thermos. The committee met around that long fluorescent table. We argued gently about liability forms and background checks. We wrote down schedules and training sessions. Pastor Reynolds read every line with the kind of care he gave to his sermons. Sometimes he looked at me and I could see he was trying to translate generosity into policy. It was a new skill for him. Diane made a casserole list and then volunteered to teach an ESL class, which made her cheeks flush pink like a girl being brave. There are nights I still go to that little doorway where I handed over the coat. The wood of the church steps still smells like rain and the oils the sexton uses. I cup my hands and remember the way the coat fell across his shoulders, how he folded himself into it like someone taking a benediction. The brooch that Harold gave me is no longer pinned to a wool lapel. I keep it under my pillow sometimes, a small weight reminding me that I am the same and not the same at once. Not everything is settled. People still measure and worry. There are moments when the fellowship hall feels like a chessboard. Each kindness watched as if it might be a move. But there are other moments, children spilling color across the pews, a woman from our choir teaching a refugee mother the words to a hymn, that feel like stitches being taken carefully. The fabric is mending where it had frayed. One Sunday after service, I stayed behind and sat in the third pew where Harold always liked the aisle. The varnish remembered his elbow the way a pillow remembers a head. The church was quiet but alive. The lights hummed like bees. I watched the doorway as people left. Old friends, new faces, someone in a bright sock that made me smile. Someone closed the heavy wooden door behind them and, for a second, I thought I felt the church exhale. When I finally rose, my knees complained, as they always will. I smoothed my skirt and pinned the brooch to the inside of my cardigan instead of my lapel. It felt proper to keep the memory close to my heart, a warmth that was not flashy but steady. Outside, the bench by the brick path was empty. The sky had that washed look rain leaves when it has finished speaking. I heard footsteps, a small congregation of them recede down the walk. Diane's heel tapping a child's slippered foot, the soft shuffle of the treasurer. They moved away as if a story had just been read, and now the town was meant to go on with it. A gust of wind pushed against the church door, and it swung almost shut with a decisive wooden click. For a beat I thought of endings. The way a door closes on a chapter, the way a hand is withdrawn after a goodbye. But the wind did something else too. It nudged the door so it could be latched, not slammed. It kept the warmth inside while the world outside aired itself. I stayed by the threshold and listened to the sound of the church, the faint echo of footsteps in the nave, the low settling of wood, and then slowly I walked away. Each step on the path made a tiny sound, my shoes finding purchase on wet stone. When I turned the corner, the door closed behind me and the click was final enough to mean something had changed. The bench remained empty, not an absence but an invitation. The rain had left the air clear the way a promise feels after a hard conversation. I breathed in and felt it, a small hollow that was not lost but room. Room for more songs, more coats, more tea and casseroles and committee papers. Room for people to come and for some to go. For old rhythms to be reshaped by small stubborn acts. The wind smoothed my hair and the town's slow, careful alive seemed for the first time in a while to be learning how to open. I learned in the slow after of all of it, that change doesn't arrive in proclamations. It arrives in the hush after a sermon, in the scrape of a chair as someone leans forward, in a treasurer clearing his throat and deciding he can stretch the numbers by a line or two. It comes in the way Pastor Reynolds' apology felt less like a retreat, and more like someone lowering a shield for the first time in years. It came in Diane's casserole list, stiff at first, then braver. And in the way a little boy from a far-off place sang the second verse of an old hymn with the kind of conviction that makes you forget to breathe. The committee met with paper and tea. We wrote policies with the same awkward care as a family reading an unfamiliar will. Pastor Reynolds insisted on checklists. Daniel insisted on visiting homes. Diane insisted on teaching the first ESL class, and she surprised herself by laughing while she volunteer signed. I surprised myself by saying yes to going on those visits. My knees complained, of course. Smaller truths remained stubborn, but each awkward handshake, each shuffling footprint across a kitchen tile, felt like a seam being stitched. People kept their distance in ways that are easy to mistake for politeness, stepping aside in the fellowship hall, hastening the coffee cup handoff. I held on to the moments that didn't retreat, like the refugee mother who pressed a hand to my shoulder and thanked me in halting English, eyes wet and bright. Like the teenager who finally offered to fold hymnals, and then stayed to help with the after-school art project. Like Pastor Reynolds, who sat through training and asked more than once how background checks actually work. These were small reconciliations, not headlines. They were the steady work of someone learning to live on new terms. There were also the quieter costs. Invitations I never received again. The rumor-soft conversations. I meant well, but that trail behind your back like an aftersmoke. It is a strange thing to be both noticed and avoided. To be the subject of Sunday morning sermons and then the one people avoid sitting next to at the potluck. I won't lie. There were nights I pinched the silver brooch under my pillow and asked myself if I had done the right thing. I would breathe the metal against my skin until the shape steadied me. And yet, the proof was in details that won't show up in minutes or budgets. A little girl with a scarf too long for her shoulders learning to tie a bow. A lunch table where a Spanish phrase gets repeated until someone gets it right and everyone laughs. A volunteer form filled out and someone showing up to teach an English class. Layla's letter stayed folded in my Bible for weeks, her loops of ink a reminder that one garment, given on a rain-soaked night, had been the hinge on a story that led families to us. Sometimes kindness needs policy. Sometimes policy needs courage. We built both. We wrote safety guidelines and training modules, and we learned how to welcome without sacrificing stewardship. Pastor Reynolds learned to walk the line between caution and fear, and in doing so he found a way to protect the church he loved without building walls it couldn't pass through. Daniel kept visiting. Diane kept cooking. I kept going. On Sundays the choir grew. Voices, new and old, found harmony. The pews filled in shifts. The faces I had always known, and the faces that had only known exile. Not everyone stayed. Change is messy and some people choose the comfort of what was. But more people stayed than left, and that, to me, felt like a small miracle. There is a tenderness to living after a thing like this. The town rearranged itself around the new work. It was never tidy. There were missteps and apologies and that awful, honest fumbling people do when they try to become better neighbors. I sat in the third pew often, where Harold liked the aisle, feeling both more visible and somehow lighter. The brooch now rests inside my cardigan most days. A private warmth instead of a badge. Sometimes I reach for it and remember a man's rough hands, the wool closing around him like a benediction. People ask me if I regret it. Giving the coat, speaking up at the council, letting the story be told from the pulpit. I can see why they ask. The world is safer when the smallest kindness can be labeled reckless. But when Layla's son sang our hymn and didn't lower his voice at the end, I knew the answer without thinking. When a woman I barely knew brought lemon cake to a new family and stayed to listen, I knew it again. We are still learning how to be a church that welcomes without losing itself. The work goes on in committees, in kitchens, in the clarifying of forms, and in the simplest thing, someone noticing when a person needs shelter from the rain. I carry that memory, the weight of the coat, the click of the brooch, the way his shoulders eased, like a small secret that keeps me upright. And sometimes, late at night, I pin the brooch to the inside of my sweater, feel its cool against my heart, and I let the town be what it will. The secret I keep is this. One small warmth can make room for many. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, Share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.